Oh, yeah, let's get a little zoom in there. We don't want it blurry, you know. Okay, that should be good enough. All right. So, as I was just saying, as I reinstated our zoom, the transcendental states in a story. What do I mean by that? Don't be alarmed. It's pretty simple. Okay, transcendental experiences are moments where logic weakens, where perception shifts, and where awareness expands. Okay? In my scripts, in our script that we've been working on, it appears as a dreamlike sequence. It appears as a sense of time distortion. It appears in what we've talked about before, liminal spaces. Okay? It appears in silence, in stillness. Really, there's a huge connection to that, to meditation, right? I mean, it's a direct connection to meditation. In transcendental meditation, the mind quiets, identity softens, and awareness expands. Okay? And our scenes ought to replicate that. Okay? Because then the audience is pulled into a state of observation rather than reaction. Okay? That's our goal with that, is we want our audience to be pulled into a state of observation rather than reaction. Let's touch on the trauma and human psychology element of our writing again. Okay? Trauma in life, but more specifically in this writing, trauma shapes perception. Okay? Trauma shapes behavior. Trauma shapes identity. And our scripts ought to reflect fragmented memory, emotional suppression, sudden behavioral shifts, and an internal contradiction. Right? There's a psychological truth to this. People do not behave logically under emotional pressure. Okay? We behave reactively. We behave defensively. Or if you're like me, we behave inconsistently. So, how do we apply this in writing? Well, have characters contradict themselves. Okay? Have dialogue that avoids truth. And when you're showing actions, have actions that are intentional. Have actions that reveal deeper wounds. Okay? Trauma in a story structure is crucial. Okay? And how do we go about this? Let's make sure you guys can see this. All right? Well, this is how it goes. Okay? This is how trauma is used in a story structure. We have past, experience, right? Which then goes to an internal conflict of some sort. Okay? Which then goes to present behavior. Which then leads to an external consequence. There we go. It's okay if you can't see it. I'm going to vocalize it a couple times for you. But this is how trauma is used in a story structure. All right, we got our past experience, which then will lead to an internal conflict of some sort, which then will present behavior, a certain behavior, to bring out a behavior, which then leads to an external consequence, something on the outside world that gets them into some kind of trouble. Okay? The character's past is not a backstory. Okay? It is their current operating system. Man, let's read that together again. A character's past is not a backstory. Rather, it is their current operating system. And that's how it works. Okay? I'm going to get rid of this now. But for our Zoomers, I'll say it one more time. Past experience leads to the internal conflict, which presents a behavior, which then leads to an external consequence. Okay? That's how trauma is used in a story structure. Okay? There you go. Let's look at our next thing now. Let's jump into the silence, right? That silence I keep talking about, that stillness, that presence. Okay? How does that apply? Well, we've got to go back in history again, all right, folks? Ancient storytelling relied heavily on pauses, tone, and presence. Okay? Not constant explanation. You're going to drive people nuts with that. It's just not good writing. Let's look at our forerunners, right? Ancient storytelling, all about pauses, tone, and presence. Those guys knew what they were doing. So in our scripts, we ought to really use the silence. Utilize silence, right? It creates tension. Utilize the stillness because it creates awareness. And utilize minimalism, okay? Because minimalism creates meaning. Creates great, profound meaning. Okay? This works because the audience then begins to project their own thoughts. Okay? They begin to fill in the emotional gaps. And they begin to engage more deeply. Right? Silence invites the audience into the story. Silence invites the audience into the story. Okay, good. Let's go to our next thing here. Let's look at the bigger picture now. We're going to jump into folklore, right? Myth, and these fire-based storytelling that I was talking about earlier, right? Across many, many, many cultures. Stories told around the fire shared a variety of things, but really a common trait, and that of which it was simplicity on the surface. Okay? Their stories were easy to follow. There was clear imagery to them. Another thing these stories had was they had a lot of depth underneath, right? They had this moral ambiguity. They had this symbolic meaning. And they had this emotional resonance. Another thing they had was repetition. And they had rhythm. Okay? These were patterns that reinforced meaning. And these were ideas that return in different forms. Another thing about these old, very wise stories is they had unexplained elements. Which really, that means the mystery of the whole thing, right? The mystery is preserved in these stories. And not everything is resolved. Not everything was resolved. The mystery was preserved. Okay, we want to bring that. We want to incorporate that into our writing. We need to, when we're writing a scene, we need to appear simple moment to moment. And we ought to have thought-provoking characters and dialogue, and what will you, that contain deeper psychological and spiritual layers. And we ought to rely on pattern, tone, and repetition. And of course, we need to leave space for interpretation. The oldest stories were not clear. The oldest stories were not clear. They were powerful. They were powerful. Okay? So, let's look at the role of our audience, okay? And when we're writing, we're talking about this spiritual storytelling thing. Well, in spiritual storytelling, the audience is not passive, okay? They are interpreting. They are reflecting. They are connecting. Okay? It's the experience of it all. The audience is recognizing something within themselves, and they process it emotionally, and it leaves them changed in some way or another. So our goal is not to give answers, but to create conditions for realization. The meaning of the story is completed inside the audience. The meaning of the story. Hold on, hold the phone, folks. Hold on. Hold on. Listen to this. Listen. The meaning of the story is completed inside the audience. Okay? Let's look at the spiritual weight in modern screenwriting. Okay. You know, a true script gains spiritual weight when it reflects real human truth. Okay? And when it avoids over-explaining, of course, as I said before. And when it has created space for interpretation. And when it leaves an emotional residue. Okay? So, we can compare it to modern screenwriting. A weak script is going to explain everything. It's going to resolve everything. It's going to leave nothing behind. It's boring. It's just whatever. But a strong script is always going to suggest meaning. It's going to reveal truth gradually, and it's going to leave a lasting impression. Okay? So if I'm going to wrap this little thing up, I would say storytelling at its highest level is not about plot or structure. Okay? Let's read that again. I like that part. Storytelling at its highest level is not about plot or structure. No, it's about perception, it's about emotion, it's about memory, and it's about meaning. What is your audience interpretation? And you ought to learn how to like that, and love on it, and study it, and observe it. The most powerful stories are not just simply told, folks. They are experienced. They are absorbed. And they are remembered. Now I got another thing here for you, folks. That was our transcendental storytelling, though, and how to use screenwriting as a spiritual transmission. Very good stuff, I think. Important stuff to think about. But I got another little diagram thing that I can write, but let's check our zooms. Zoom, zoom. We got our zoomers here. All right. Okay. We got about 10 more minutes. Give or take, maybe 13 minutes. Worst case, this class will just go on a little later, but I think we can wrap it up in about 13 minutes. Can do this quickly. So let's go ahead and just look at the two things that we talked about, right? Our neurocinematic, right? Our neurocinematic plus transcendental story system. Okay? Let's look at this neurocinematic and transcendental story system. Well, let's go to the core ideas, right? We have our story, of course. Our story, which takes us to experience, right? Our story should be an experience, okay? Which, if it is, that'll create a brain response, okay? Which then creates that internal realization, okay? Which then will create spiritual residue, or that residual meaning, right? So that's the core idea of both of the two little lectures I had for you. Really, that's what it is we write a story that will give our audience the experience to then have the brain response to then create the internal realization, which will then inevitably, will guaranteed 156 times 200 million% create the residual meaning, the spiritual residue. Spiritual residue, okay? Here, let's just spiritual residue, right? The big SR, hey, spiritual residue, okay? It's very important, very, very important, folks. Okay? Hopefully you get that. Hopefully you get that. So, I mean, we can go over it a little more if you want. Let's see. Let's go ahead and just erase this. It's not a lot of room up here on this board. For the frame of the camera, of course, unless I had one of the widescreen millimeter actual cameras. So, let's do this. Yeah. Experimental later. Okay? So, let's just look at the transcendental story side of things, right? We have our spiritual and our experimental level, right? And that's everything to do with experience, to emotion, to the internal shift, okay, which then is the reflection, and our spiritual residue, okay? So, in the transcendental story theory, you can look at it just like this, right? We got our experience, which conveys emotion, which then turns into the internal shift, which then goes to the reflection, which then will turn into spiritual residue, right? Key components of this, again, liminal states, right? Liminal states, liminal places. These liminal states, they're in between identity. They are transitional spaces for personal growth, for observation. Touching more on the observation, right? The silence, the stillness, that's bringing awareness, it's increasing. That's the audience projects meaning from that. Substance deep inside. And trauma, right? Trauma and memory, the fragmented perception and that emotional truth over logic. Okay? And again, the folklore roots. Go back in history, folks. Study some of these cultures of how they used to tell stories. Okay? They were simple on the surface. They had extremely profound, deep, symbolic meaning. And they had an unresolved mystery that human beings just couldn't wait to dig in and try to ponder on it, wonder, right? Like the boy in our script, childlike wonder. That's what a good story brings out of a human being. Okay? Our audience enters this. It's an observation state of deep self-reflection. And then they are able to have a discovery of meaning, right? Meaning discovery. Okay? And now let's look at our right side. It's funny, we got a left and right side, kind of like the brain. Which, by the way, here we go, right? Brain and cognitive layer. Cognitive layer. Okay, and again, this is the neuro side of things, right? The neurocinematic theory is that of which, we start with our brain and the cognitive level, right? So we have our stimulus. Okay? We have our stimulus, which operates as our scene, of course. And then we have our emotional response, right? Emotional response, which then goes into curiosity, right? Curiosity, and I would even say tension, right? Tension. Ooh, tension. Curiosity, tension, pattern recognition. Boom. Pattern recognition. Okay? And then that leads to the memory encoding. Memory encoding. Okay, that's our neuro way of looking at it. Let's look at it through the brain, right? We have our stimulus, which is our scene. We have our emotional response. We have our curiosity and tension, which then is creating a pattern recognition, which then creates the memory encoding. Okay? Key brain systems. Emotion first. Okay? Emotion is first. It's always feeling before understanding. Okay, and then we go back to that thing, that curiosity loop, if you will. Right? The unanswered questions equals engagement. Okay, let's go to our pattern recognition, right? Pattern seeking. Meaning through repetition. And our mirror neurons, right? We're mirroring the brain here. Mirror neurons. The audience feels what they see. Okay, which then goes to our silence, our stillness, quite literally it's called the default mode network, right? Where reflection activates. And then we have our tone shock, where attention resets. Okay? The result of this is the audience is experiencing the engagement, the immersion, the personal connection, which creates the pathways to memory. Okay? So let's even go further. Let's see how these two systems merge. Well, we have our scenes here. I'll even write it down for you. Let's erase this again. And let me double check again our zoomies. Good. Oh, yes, it's lovely, isn't it? Yeah. Okay.